So what happened? The UAE, the Saudi regime, and Qatar, they invested billions of dollars from their sovereign wealth funds in this investment fund created by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, based in Florida. And then what did Kushner's investment firm do with that money? It invested that money in Israeli companies that profit from Israeli settlements. In other terms, the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, and the Qatari regime are profiting from Israeli colonization of Palestinian land. So not only have these regimes done nothing to help the Palestinians, they are directly complicit in the colonization of Palestinian land and the genocide against the Palestinian people. This is why the late and great Palestinian revolutionary leader, intellectual, Ghassan Kanafani, famously argued that it's not just the Israeli regime and Israeli colonialism that is the enemy of the Palestinian people, but also what he referred to as the reactionary Arab regimes, in particular the Gulf monarchies that have for decades collaborated with U.S. imperialism and helped the U.S. empire and the Israeli regime try to crush all of the resistance movements in West Asia. And over decades, those resistance movements have evolved in different ways, right? So, during the first Cold War, many of these resistance movements were led by communists. Like in the Palestinian case, there was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. They still exist, but they're not the largest Palestinian armed group today. And there were similar groups in other parts of the region. You also had revolutionary left-wing Arab nationalism, like Nasser in Egypt. You also had the rise of Baathism, which was a socialist Arab nationalist movement. And you had the more left-wing variety, which was in Syria, and the more right-wing variety that was in Iraq. But they were also committed to fighting against Israeli colonialism and supporting the struggle of the Arab peoples against Western colonialism. So after destroying all the communist movements, the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia destroyed all of the Arab nationalist movements. Ironically, there was a kind of proxy war backed by the US between Saudi Arabia and Egypt under Nasser in Yemen. So Yemen has been a big part of this for a long time. During the first Cold War, Yemen was divided between North and South, which basically it is again today, almost on the exact same boundaries. And South Yemen had a Marxist government that was very close to the Soviet Union. And the US and Saudi Arabia were trying to use the northern part of Yemen to wage a proxy war against the Arab nationalist movements, especially Nasser's Egypt. So what we saw is that the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia destroyed all of the Arab nationalist movements. The overthrow of the Syrian government was basically the end of Arab nationalism as a force that had state power. The Iraqi Ba'athist government was destroyed by the US in the invasion of 2003. Syria's Ba'athist government has been overthrown. Libya, Gaddafi was also a revolutionary Arab nationalist. His government was destroyed. So now that the US and Israel destroyed all of the communist movements and all of the Arab nationalist movements, now they're going after all of the Islamic-oriented nationalist resistance movements. And like I said, I think the best way to understand movements like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Ansar Allah in Yemen or the PMFs, the Hashid forces in Iraq, which is called the Islamic Resistance of Iraq. All of these movements are basically, you can think of them as a combination of kind of third world nationalist movements and liberation Shia Islam. And now these are the largest, most powerful resistance groups in the region. And the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia are committed once again to destroying all of the resistance, making sure that the region can be entirely dominated by US imperialism. And we see that most of the regimes in the region are a bunch of puppet regimes controlled by the US. Jordan being the greatest example. The Jordanian monarchy is a joke. I mean, people in Jordan joke that the king of Jordan speaks Arabic with an English accent because English is his first language. I mean, he's definition of a puppet. And when Iran responded to Israeli attacks against sovereign Iranian territory, including its consulate in Syria, in an act of self-defense that was in accordance with international law, the Jordanian regime intercepted or tried to intercept Iranian rockets and missiles to protect Israel. So this is the situation we're dealing with. Yemen and Iran at this point are the only states that are actually resisting Israel's genocide in the region. There are resistance movements in Lebanon, but they don't have state power. There are resistance movements in Iraq, of course. They don't have state power. And then, of course, there's the Palestinians who don't have a state because the U.S. has prevented them from having a state. So now we see the continuation of this, where the U.S. is trying to destroy the Yemeni resistance. So this is not a new project, of course. I already talked about how throughout the past several decades, the war on all of the anti-imperialist resistance movements in West Asia has continued and has changed in different ways as the movements have evolved. But Yemen is an example of how you don't need to be the richest country in the region. You can stand up and fight to try to stop genocide and resist colonialism. And that's why Ansar Allah, this movement in Yemen, has actually now become very popular all across the Arab majority world, all across West Asia. Many people have been praising them because they see them as standing up against imperialism, standing up against Israel's genocide. And again, it's so symbolic, the fact that they're the poorest country in the region. It shows, and the fact they don't have the most advanced military technology. They're making these very cheap drones. And yes, Iran is helping them. They don't dispute that, but they're not Iranian proxies. They're allies of Iran. And why do they have all of these weapons? Well, I already mentioned that some of them, they're making their own drones for very small amounts of money. And then Israel is spending millions of dollars through its Iron Dome system and other weapons that were provided by the U.S. So the U.S. military-industrial complex benefits and enriches itself, and Israel's spending all of this money. And by the way, you know who backs Israeli bonds? The U.S. government. So Israel goes further and further into debt to pay for all of these weapons from the U.S. by selling bonds, which are sold on Wall Street and backed by U.S. banks. And the U.S. government has said that if Israel defaults on its bonds, the U.S. government will make sure that the bondholders are made whole, that the U.S. will make sure that they're paid. So again, Israel is an extension of the U.S. empire. None of this, without U.S. support, Israel could not do any of this. This was even admitted by Israeli military officials in an article in Haaretz. They said if the U.S. withdrew support, this war, the genocidal war in Gaza, would end within 2 weeks. I would say within one day.